Hi, today I'm going to tell you how I turned this
Do something.
into this. I had quite a few of these oak cutoffs lying around from a project I did, and I was trying to think of something that I could make with them. Well, I've been playing a lot of Smash lately, and the funny thing about Nintendo characters is that most of them tend to do battle against tennis-playing turtles or boxing crocodiles, but Kirby, he tends to concern himself more with nightmare gods, alien symbiotes, your run-of-the-mill eldritch horror. And throughout all this, his weapon of choice, among other things, big ol' wooden hammer. So that is what I'm gonna make. One extra condition for this build though, since it started with scraps, it's gonna end with scraps. That means I can't buy anything for the entire build. It all has to be stuff that I already have lying around the shop. Should be a fun challenge. As always, timestamp down below if you just wanna see the finished product. As for how I was actually gonna build this thing, at the end of the day, the hammer's head essentially amounts to a big barrel. So I'm gonna make it the same way I'd make one of those. The thing about barrel making though, is that it's actually its own trade called coopering. So there's tons of specialized techniques and tools and bits of expertise that make the process possible. I don't know anything about any of those, so I just figured I'd wing it and make it up as I go. Besides, it's a barrel. How hard could it be? The first thing to do was to make the barrel stabs. Those are the vertical curved pieces that make up the barrel's body. I didn't know much, but I did know that the stabs would have to bend, and when it comes to wood, bendable generally goes hand in hand with thin, which was actually perfect because I had very little stock to work with and I needed to stretch it as far as I could. So I ended up resawing the pieces into thinner strips on the table saw, accomplishing thinness and conservation of materials all at once. That means cutting them vertically on the table saw, cleaning up that face on the jointer, and over to the planer to trim them down till they're nice and bendy. Then I had the difficult task of actually figuring out the stab's dimensions. I had to divide the barrel into 10 pieces, accounting for the taper of the hammer's head, plus the curvatures of the varying circumferences that are a product of that taper. I had the help of the internet, 3D modeling software, some fairly involved circle geometry, and I'm still not sure I got it right. Which begs the question, how the is Cranky Kong making all these goddamn barrels? I assume that's what he's doing back there. Jungle Japes in that little shack, creeping around. Does Cranky make the barrels? Is that canon? If there's an answer, let me know in the comments. Thank you. After calculating my dubious measurements, I had to figure out how to actually cut them. In woodworking, straight lines are pretty easy. It's usually just a matter of measuring accurately, setting the tool correctly, and then making the cut. Curves, on the other hand, are notoriously difficult. And I had a lot of curves to cut, so I had to make a template. I ended up taking a scrap piece of MDF and measuring out the stab's outline every couple inches, making kind of a graduated connect the dots. Then, in order to recreate a natural curve, I took a thin piece of wood and bent it to match the line of those measurements, attaching with a brad nailer as I went along. Then I trimmed off most of the excess on the bandsaw and used the belt sander to bring everything down nice and flush. After popping off the guides, cleaning things up a little bit, pretty satisfied. I made the Mdf template because I needed 10 identical pieces and I didn't want to have to meticulously measure each one out every single time. It was much easier to just do that once and then copy that shape onto all the oak stabs. I traced the outline and then cut them pretty close to that line on the bandsaw, maybe about 1/8 of an inch oversized. From there, all I had to do was tape the template down onto the oak and cut it down to size using a flush trim router bit. It's a router bit with a bearing that's perfectly in line with the cutting edge. The bearing slides along a template and the cutting edge trims off everything that juts out past that template. The only problem with this is that due to the inner geometry of the circle, the edges couldn't be 90 degrees. It just meant that I had to use a bit with a slight chamfer on it. Exact same principle, it just cuts the edge at a little bit of an angle. Just like that, I had my stabs. So far, so good. This is the point where my build started to deviate a little bit from what I would expect a normal barrel making process to look like, because I needed some form of internal structure. For one, because the hammer's handle has to attach to something down the line. And two, the barrel stabs need some kind of form, a shape to bend to. I decided to cut some more MDF into circles that would serve as this inner structure. In woodworking, cutting circles is something that always seems really intimidating, but it's actually pretty straightforward. I just used a standard circle cutting table saw jig. I won't get too into the weeds about how I actually made it. There's plenty of tutorials here on YouTube if you're curious, nothing special about mine. For those of you no doubt thinking, hey, I thought this was scraps only. What's with all the MDF? Pro tip, if you're ever looking for really cheap sheet goods, I'm talking MDF, plywood, pegboard,
etc. Did you just mispronounce etc.?
Things get damaged during shipment all the time, and most hardware stores have a bin or a rack of damaged goods that they'll sell at a deep, deep discount. It's not always displayed, you might have to ask for it, and obviously if you need full intact sheets, it doesn't work, but I bought a sheet of ultralight MDF, should be like 80 bucks, I think it was 15, and I keep it around the shop in case I need it. All right, tip over, back to the build. After cutting a few circles, varying sizes, it was time to put it all together. The plan was to attach the bottom edge of the oak to the smallest MDF circle using a brad nailer, but it did not work at all. The MDF wouldn't hold the nails. The oak, despite being thin, was still too rigid and was pulling, wanting to straighten itself back out again. Back to the drawing board. I was pretty sure the concept was still sound, it just needed some tweaks. Instead of the nail gun, I decided to use plywood rings to apply that external bending pressure. I made them using my same circle cutting jig combined with the bandsaw and then wrapped everything in tape so that nothing would stick together during the glue up. At that point, I had one end of the barrel more or less assembled. The plan was to work my way up the barrel, gluing as I went. The plywood ring would provide the outer bending force, and the MDF circle would provide the shape and inner structure. I only got as far as one ring before it became immediately obvious this was not gonna work. There still wasn't enough force being applied. The stabs didn't want to bend, and even in the brief moments of hope where it seemed like they might, there was no way to really measure anything. It was sloppy and messy and frustrating and a total f***ing wash. Score one for Cranky Kong. Now this is the point where my nice, fun, simple little project started to escalate. I'd already glued the ends together so they were totally unsalvageable. Luckily, the first stage of the process hadn't changed. I still had my template, and making the new stabs was relatively quick. But I still needed a new plan. After angrily stewing on it all night, I realized that I needed something more substantial to attach the stabs to. A kind of rigid inner structure that would be the exact same size and shape of the interior of the barrel. I decided to build essentially a skeleton for the hammer's head using the same circle cutting MDF technique from before. Then I cut some vertical supports on the bandsaw. After figuring out where I wanted everything to end up, it was just your basic glue and pressure fit job to get everything assembled. That was step one of the new plan. Step two, although the oak was as thin as I could get it using the tools that I have here in my shop, it was still too rigid and it wanted to push back into its original shape. I needed that bend to be permanent, so I found a suitable bin, filled it up with water. If you soak wood for long enough and then let it dry in a new shape, it'll hold that shape, at least for the most part. The key to that though is to find a form that more or less fits that final desired shape. This is where I started to regret those self-imposed rules. It all has to be stuff that I already have lying around the shop. After digging around for a while, I found this old 4-inch piece of ABS plumbing pipe that I had used to put together a dust collection system, and I thought that it just might work. The circumference obviously wasn't the same as the hammer's head, but it didn't have to be. I sliced it into quarters on the table saw, and it actually ended up pretty close. Besides, I didn't need the curve to be perfect, I just needed it to be curved so that it wouldn't be constantly exerting force trying to spring back to flat. I soaked the stabs for a few hours, popped them in the clamp, let them dry, and boom! I had some reasonably curved pieces. Okay, I had my bent pieces, I had my form, time to put it all together. This time without the spring force of the oak, the brad nailing strat worked perfect. Then I taped up the end as well, just for some extra reinforcement so nothing would pop out when I got to the bending phase. Speaking of which, I also needed to find a way to exert a ton of force on the outside of the barrel. I have a bunch of old nylon rock climbing slings that are rated to something like 20 kilonewtons of force. Nylon has a shelf life, so they're not safe to use climbing, but for this kind of thing, they're perfect. I decided to use a screwdriver to twist the sling and pull everything together. I had it all. Form, pieces, clamping method, time to do some bending. And it didn't work. It didn't work. I was gutted. In hindsight, it makes sense. I mean, the oak doesn't want to bend in two directions at once, but I guess I was just kind of hoping it would work out. I mean, I've seen barrels. They exist. It must be possible, right? I mean, yeah, barrels exist, but clearly their arcane secrets were well beyond me. Thought it might be time to give up. And then I had an idea. I realized that the oak is super pliable when it's still wet, so I just had to mold it into its final hammer shape before it dried. The thing is, I had thought about this idea before and dismissed it because you can't glue wet wood, and I had no idea how to attach it to the hammer in that wet state. But the missing piece was that I didn't have to bend the oak into the shape of the hammer. I just had to bend it into something that had the same shape of the hammer. My ABS form was just half baked, so I baked it all the way. ABS plastic starts to melt at around 200 degrees C, which is well within the confines of your standard convection oven. I just cooked it until it was nice and soft and then molded it to the shape of my inner structure. I'd like to use this opportunity to apologize to anyone in advance who ever happens to eat a meal that was cooked in my oven. I finally had the right shape, so I clamped my pieces into the cool and now rigid plumbing pipe and gave them a little help drying with the heat gun. This was my last chance. I was all out of oak, so if this didn't work, it was all for nothing. Would the stars finally align, or would that old bastard Cranky Kong have the last laugh after all? Turns out a bit of both. I attached the stabs to the form using a combination of tuck tape and brad nails. Just on the ends though. I knew I would have to exert a ton of pressure to get all those gaps to close up in the middle, so I decided to just worry about the ends first until that glue is nice and dry and everything is firmly locked in place. Sure enough, once I unwrapped my little parcel, I had some very substantial gaps. Not to worry, all according to plan. I squeezed some glue into those gaps and then used my tourniquet technique to apply as much force as I possibly could, just like the traditional coopers of yore. And it worked! The gaps were closed, but the next day I was met with a heart-wrenching surprise. As the glue dried and the pieces all kind of shifted, the gaps opened up again. Worse than they were before, and there was no closing them back up again. After all this time and effort, it sucked. The shape was right, sure, and it was super solid, but the gaps were so ugly, there was no way I could let that slide. Then I realized I didn't have to. I was never making a barrel, I was just making something that looked like a barrel. Hope wasn't lost. Okay, I'll admit it, I'm not a cooper, and I probably never will be. But making a thing look like a thing, that's right in my wheelhouse. I had to cover the gaps in a subtle way. Thank God I used oak for this because I happened to have a roll of oak veneer that I bought for another project and just never ended up using. Veneer is still wood, it's just really thin. Thin enough that I could cut it by hand into the shape of a smaller oak stab, and then glue it onto the hammer to cover the gaps. And because it's so thin, I could just feather down the edges until you couldn't even tell that they weren't all solid pieces. After literal days of work, I finally had my hammerhead. Now I could finally get started on the fun part. Okay, so Kirby's hammer has these little bands around the outside edges, and while the material type seems to vary from iteration to iteration, I'm just gonna go ahead and treat them as metal. And I just so happen to have some in stock. Obviously they were all scraps and offcuts, so normally I would make them out of one long piece, but I didn't have enough material to do that, so I had to cut out smaller pieces and then join them together end to end. I stuck my angle grinder into a bench vise because I find that it's easier to keep the cutting edge stationary, almost like I'm using a bandsaw. Now you can work with metal on a belt sander, just like with wood. The only consideration is that if you have it hooked up to any kind of dust collection system, please disconnect that before you do. After doing a little test fit, I found that the metal didn't really bend the way I wanted it to. The bands were too fat and they ended up making these kind of flat spots. Unacceptable. I cut the bands into smaller strips so they'd be more malleable. Those would bend just fine. Before attaching them, I had to deal with the hammer's coloring. The oak's natural color was close, but not quite dark enough, so I had to stain it. Besides, the stain would help to disguise any inconsistency in color between the solid wood and the veneer. Then it was time for the ends. First, I filled and sanded all the holes using regular wood filler, and then just painted it pink. Looked god-awful, way too saturated, almost neon. So I sanded it off, tried something a little more mellow, way better. And then I just attached the band with super glue and packing tape. The metal banding extends onto the hammer's face too, so I had to do a little more metal work. Again, I didn't want to have to meticulously measure every single piece, so I decided to make a template. This is where it got tricky though, because of the limited materials. I needed 4 half circles, but there was no way to make those all fit on the sheet metal that I had. But 8 quarter circles would fit just fine. I'd have to make them in pieces and then assemble them down the road. This was more or less the same process as the bands, just a lot more finesse. After that, back to the sander till I had some nice clean little quarter circles. I did another test fit at this point and things just looked flat and underwhelming. It needed some depth, so I made some little wooden spacers, basically as thin as my planer would go. Then I traced the outline of the quarter circles and bandsawed and sanded them till everything was nice and flush, and I am exhausted just remembering this. Then everything got glued up. Quarter circles, the last bit of banding to cover up those wooden edges. I even cut some interior strips as well. Then once everything was dry and secure, it was time to make everything look not terrible. Pretty much everything was covered in glue, so I had to use a combination of chisels, scrapers, and sanders to get everything cleaned up. Then one last coat of stain to cover up the mess I just made. I was getting so close. The finish line was right there. Next step, handle. Compared to the existential hell that I had just put myself through, this was a cakewalk. I had set aside some oak for this at the beginning of the process. All I had to do was clean it up and then glue it together till it was nice and thick. It did have to bear the weight of the hammer at the end of the day. I used a spoke shave to round the thing out and then sanded it till it was nice and smooth. Attaching it to the hammer's head was also relatively simple. I didn't have enough material to go all the way through the width of the hammer, so I just decided to use 2 shorter pieces that I would attach end to end and give the illusion of one continuous piece. As for actually attaching it, the first thing I did was to drill holes on opposing sides of the hammerhead that were the same size as the outside of the handle. Then I drilled another smaller hole, basically as deep as my drill bit would allow. The plan was to slide a 1/4 inch piece of steel rod into both sides of the connection so that I could swing the hammer around without having to worry about splintering any purely wooden joints. For a bonding agent, I ended up using 2-part epoxy. 1, because it's crazy strong, and 2, it's one of the few adhesives that'll stick equally well to wood and metal. Last step. Kirby's hammer has little stars on the end. It's unclear to me whether it's supposed to be just painted on or not, but I decided to make something 3-dimensional. This led to an interesting problem though. How was I gonna make a wooden star? There's no way I could cut it on the bandsaw without it looking all rough and uneven and terrible. Plus, I didn't even know how to draw a perfect 5-pointed star. Maybe I didn't have to. A star seems like a really intimidating shape, but at the end of the day, it's just 5 triangles. So I decided to make another template. I used the bandsaw to cut the initial rough shapes and then brought them down to their final finished size on the belt sander. Then once I had my 5 triangles, I laid them all out and attached them to a piece of MDF using the brad nailer. I took the whole mess over to the bandsaw and I cut it as close to the line as I reasonably could. Then it was back to the router. The flush trim bits got a lot of action this build. Now that I had my template, it was easy enough to trace the outlines and cut off the excess. I also decided to sand down the edges so things were nice and soft and cartoony looking. Just like that, perfect stars. At this point, all the frustrations of the past few days started to just melt away, and I remembered why I did this in the first place. I thought back to my first time playing Kirby's Adventure and that iconic opening screen. First you draw a circle, then you dot the eyes. Add a big ol' smile, presto, it's Kirby. Well, if you made it this far, thanks for watching. As far as I'm concerned, only one thing left to do.